Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for tuning in and welcome to another Fundamentals of Training video. The topic of the video today is length-tension relationship. Sounds kind of fancy, it's really not, but it's a very important concept for you to be able to wrap your head around, have a little bit of comprehension on, and I'm going to try to present it to you in the most simplistic way possible because this is something that honestly has been done in a research format and been tested. You don't need to know all those studies, but there is some credibility to what translates onto the gym floor based off of what length-tension relationship means. So length is speaking of the muscle length, where the muscle is actually working based off of a setup in the gym that you use. Tension refers to the amount of tension or force production it can make based off of the length that muscle is in, which is what you get length tension from, and that's how there's a relationship between both of them. That's basically, hopefully, a simplistic way for you to wrap your head around that. So if we think about muscles in general, we realize that there is a completely lengthened position for a muscle, a completely shortened position for a muscle, and everything in between it can contract in. So a lot of times when we pick things on the gym floor, we're picking a certain degree of that muscle length, and then we're contracting and stretching that muscle in that degree. An example of that is like your biceps. So your biceps have two primary functions that I'm going to use as an example. Number one, the most common one, where it flexes the elbow. Number two, it also flexes the shoulder. So we have a degree basically of bicep contraction that we can work here, or here, or here, or here, or here, okay? This is the muscle length. The muscle is lengthening. We're picking a degree of muscle length through this, and it has some sort of tension that's going to be able to create based off of that muscle length through the elbow flexion. That's starting to make sense for you? Okay, now, rule of thumb in most cases is that the shorter a muscle length is in when it's going through a contraction and a lengthening, the shorter the range is, the more tightened the muscle is as far as its starting point, the weaker it's going to be. Which means less tension potentially, less tension long term potentially, and probably less force production long term. I'm going to explain why that's important to know. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the completely lengthened range for a muscle, where the muscle's most stretched and then going through its action there. So bicep example, going through an action here, it's not as weak. It's able to produce more force. It's able to create more tension, but it's still not at the weakest place for that muscle. Or excuse me, the strongest place, all right? I'm post-leg training, so my brain's a little bit, all right? Now, if I pick the middle of that muscle length, completely lengthened, completely shortened, somewhere in the middle, this is arguably, in most cases, where your muscle is able to do its greatest degree of force production or produce its most tension, okay? So what we're starting to wrap our head around here is that the more a muscle is completely contracted, the less tension it can produce short and long term, rep to rep to rep. The more lengthened a muscle is, it can produce more tension, it can maybe tolerate more load, it can produce more force, but it's still not as great as if that muscle is in its middle range. And an example of that would be something like a leg press. Okay, example of that could be like a standing bicep curl. Okay, something of that nature. And obviously, as most of you guys should know by now from fundamentals and mechanics of actually training, the more stability that muscle has in that environment in the middle range, the more force production you can get there. So the reason why that's important is because if we're able to produce more force and more tension per repetition, we're able to create this inflammatory process and adaptation process at a greater degree, at a higher efficiency, which is ultimately going to make your process of breaking tissue down and rebuilding tissue hopefully faster, so long as you are in command of that exercise at all times. And that's a prerequisite of everything you do. You have to be in control. All right, so the first rule of thumb is you got to be able to produce tension no matter what range it's in. But once you've gotten to a point where things seem to be second nature, knowing what degree that muscle is in, what degree as far as muscle length is speaking. So what degree of muscle length that muscle's in, okay? knowing what degree that muscle length is in is going to give you an indication of, well, how much can I load this and what can I expect as far as, how deep can I take my set? Is this muscle going to flatten out really quickly like it would in the short range? Is it going to be able to produce a lot more force like it would in the lengthen range? And is this muscle really safe to grind in its middle range, like maybe in a leg press? Okay, so knowing muscle length, knowing length tension relationships helps you make sound decisions on the floor. So basically, you're not doing junk volume. If your goal is to actually have high effort sets, you're going to need high force production from rep 1 to rep 5, for example. So you're going to need to be able to choose wisely where you pick those places where you take those sets super deep, especially if you're somebody that are taking sets almost to complete failure, to complete failure, or 1 to 2 reps past failure. Okay? The one place outside of the length tension relationship that you can argue it's not quite as important is an awareness. If you've never been to the completely shortened position, you need to get there and you need to feel that. Your muscles have to have an awareness, like it's okay for me to go here, I'm not going to be hurt, and I can increase my capacity to create tension here, right? You're always going to be weakest in the short range, but don't mistake that for the fact that you can't improve your ability to create force in the short range. And the same thing goes for the lengthened position. I'm going to use the quads for an example. If you've never done any sort of like split squat, or you've never really efficiently been to the bottom of a quad dominant squat like in the hack squat, you need to get there and you need to learn what it's like to be able to produce tension in that spot. Now on the other end of the spectrum, if you've never been with good tension in the top of your leg extension, where your quads are spastically tight and they just don't want to be there, and you never tried to progress yourself as far as resistance, tension, load, and effort goes in that range of motion, that's something that you have to visit. So length tension relationship is secondary to that. Length tension relationship is a luxury. You can start to be more creative about where you place your exercises and in what order based around your goals. But in order to have very specific goals with your muscle building especially, you have to be good at contracting in all ranges of motion, which means all degrees of muscle function. So if I'm talking about my quads, both hip flexion and knee extension, I have to be really good at all degrees of that. And if I'm not, then I really haven't, in my opinion, earned the right to be too considerate of length tension relationship. But it is nice to have an understanding of that, because what it's going to do is it's going to make you better with your decisions of where you should place high effort sets. And it's also going to give you a better awareness of, how sensitive is my contraction going to be based off of what position I'm putting this muscle in. You're always going to feel a contraction better in the short range, but your effort's going to drop off much quicker. And you may not feel a contraction quite as sensitive in your lengthen range, but deeper in that set, you're going to start to feel that muscle a whole heck of a lot more. And you're probably also going to be able to produce a little bit more force for a longer period of time without flatlining in that lengthen range. And then the middle range is a nice place maybe for deep grinder sets. It's a nice place maybe for loading because it's safe and it's the strongest range as far as the length goes for that muscle. Okay, so hopefully that video sheds some light on what length tension relationship is. It's a very important thing to have a basic understanding of, and the more specific you get with your training, the more advanced you get based off of how efficient you train, the more important that terminology is going to be to you and how you conduct yourself on the gym floor, what order you operate in, and where you pick and choose to take sets to close to failure, and beyond failure. Thanks, guys.